Alright, so we're back for part two of Vietnam. Again, this is a really rough kind of outline of Vietnam. There are entire classes where you spend the entire semester looking at this war and its implications for America, because they're going to be huge to how America is going to react and even see itself later. Alright, but getting back, we fought part of the war. We're getting involved in late 50s. Kennedy's going to start sending advisors. And we have the Tet Offensive, or not Tet Offensive, Gulf of Tonkin incident. Johnson is going to increase our presence until 1968. We have over 550,000 soldiers in South Vietnam. We've essentially taken the war over for the South Vietnamese, and we're fighting the Viet Cong, these guerrillas that are in South Vietnam, trying to destabilize the government so that communism can take root. And that South Vietnam will unify with North Vietnam under a communist banner. It's a tough war, but we've been doing pretty well. We have Operation Rolling Thunder, blitzing essentially North Vietnam. Tet Offensive is going to be that turning point. We mentioned that. The Viet Cong are attacking every different city that they can, from the northern part of South Vietnam all the way down to the Mekong Delta down here, all at once. It's coordinated. It shows a complex level of planning. It shows logistics. It shows that they are not on the edge of defeat. Now, no major cities completely fall to the Viet Cong under Tet. However, even the idea that they've been able to pull off such a major coup and to launch such an attack is going to be very damaging to the U.S. psyche. Right? People are going to doubt the president's been telling them the truth, and later we're going to have the Pentagon Papers that are going to be released that's essentially going to confirm that. The war really hadn't been going that well. We had not been destabilizing or destroying the Viet Cong's ability to make war. All right, but they were putting it out there because they needed to make sure the U.S. morale stayed high. As I lean in a little bit. We won Tet Offensive. Militarily, we won the Tet Offensive, but we don't win the PR war. Another thing to remember about Vietnam is this is your first televised war. People are watching death counts, because this is how we're judging victories and defeats. Is, did we kill more of them than they killed of us? It's not about territory to hold, because the Viet Cong are in the same territory that we're fighting in. They're behind our lines, and we know that. So we're going by death counts. So they're seeing the death counts on the screen. They're seeing sons or people that look like their sons on the nightly news, getting bits of them blown away. And that's going to be damaging. That's really damaging to see that, especially when you have something like the Tet Offensive happen. So after 68, this is when the war becomes unpopular. You're going to start seeing more protests. Before the war, before 68, we had war protests on college campuses. 1968 is also going to be the year where they start changing the draft. Before this, the draft had a lot of exemptions. If you were a college student, a college male student, as long as you were in college, they would not put you into the draft pool. That's starting to change. Remember, to maintain a large army in South Vietnam, we're going to need more and more soldiers. So the draft is going to have to expand to open up and include more people who have previously been protected from it. Right, so the draft is going to become more and more and more of a hot issue that people are going to protest against the war, but they're really protesting the draft and the war together. They're being forced to go and fight in this war that they don't necessarily understand. They don't know why we're there, or why Vietnam. Why are we concentrating on stopping communism from spreading into this jungle half a world away? How is that actually protecting the United States? And these protests are going to beget more protests, because you're going to see a violent police and military reaction to them. Kent State being probably the prime example, even though Kent State is not the only example of police violence against these protests, or National Guard violence against these protests. Kent State in Ohio, There is a protest going on, and essentially the protest does turn slightly violent, where there's things thrown at the National Guard, or not National Guard, the JR, or the ROTC building on campus, the Reserve Officers Training Corps. Basically, if you're going to college but you're also planning on being a military officer after that, that's what the ROTC is for. So they are kind of attacking, or at least intimidating, the ROTC building. The National Guard is going to be called in by the governor to restore order on campus. And while they are kind of trying to break up the protests, shots ring out, and people are going to be killed over here. I'm trying to remember, I believe it is 7 that are killed at Kent State. But seeing this picture of a student crying hysterically over the body of another unarmed student, that is going to be a very powerful symbol of just how this war is affecting the home front. Because the people at home are going to be the reason why we ultimately end this war. All right, the military still wants to go in there and fight Vietnam, but it's the people back home who are saying enough. There's nothing for us to gain there. Then we're going to have My Lai. And My Lai is a village in South Vietnam that was suspected of having a large concentration of Viet Cong. What ends up happening is over 300 people in the village are going to be massacred, killed in a ditch on the orders of a U.S. Captain. It gets a little hazy as to who gave the order, but there is finally going to be a courts-martial hearing about what happened, trying to figure out exactly what the deal was, whether there was an order given to kill everybody in the village, or whether they were looking for Viet Cong. There was a conspiracy that possibly it was artillery that hit everybody and killed them. That's turned out to be a complete lie, a complete fabrication. But once this gets exposed, who looks like the bad guy? It's not the Viet Cong looking like the bad guy to the American media anymore. It's our soldiers. And maybe at least the leadership that are looking like the bad guys. And this is the reason why Vietnam soldiers weren't necessarily treated the way they probably should have been treated when they came home. Because there's so much rage about an incident like My Lai. They will be called baby killers because there were children at My Lai. Not that every Vietnam veteran was in that part of Vietnam or had that experience or were following the orders, or even if the people back home understood what was going on in Vietnam and the pressures that they were put underneath and who was enemy, who was not, you couldn't really tell. But that kind of goes into it, that it's not so clear cut that we're doing the right thing in Vietnam anymore. I mean, we're committing war crimes. Is that necessary to win this war? And if it is necessary to win this war, if we have to commit things like My Lai, is it good that we're there anymore, or should we pull out? And finally, what I alluded to earlier, the Pentagon Papers are going to be published. The newspaper, I believe it was the Washington Post or either the New York Times on this, gets a hold of papers from the generals that essentially, dating back to 1965, before Tet Offensive, that are saying that we're losing this war. We are not effectively destroying the Viet Cong's ability to fight. So that kind of shows there's a disconnect between what the government is telling us and what is actually happening on the ground in Vietnam. So, and that's just going to lead to a morale drain. More and more people are going to say we need to be out of there. So Richard Nixon is going to win his election. Lyndon Johnson knows that this Vietnam thing is tarnishing his legacy, and it's going to keep him from being reelected in 1968. So Richard Nixon is going to be put up as the Republican candidate to go up against the Democratic candidate. And essentially, so many people are disinterested in the Democratic Party because of Vietnam, because of Lyndon Johnson's commitment to Vietnam. Richard Nixon is going to win, and he's going to start the policy of ending Vietnam, peace with honor, a steady withdrawal of troops, that will allow us to train the South Vietnamese so that they can protect each other, or they can protect them. Now, at the same time, we're invading Cambodia and trying to go after the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so we've kind of expanded the war, but we're also withdrawing out of it as well. The peace with honor. We troops are mainly out of the country in 73, so it's left up to the South Vietnamese to hold off the communist invasion. Now, in 1975, the South Vietnamese general essentially is trying to consolidate his troops around Saigon. So he's going to tell his troops to leave the northern, going back to the kind of picture of South Vietnam, he's going to tell his soldiers to leave these areas on the coast and in the central highlands and concentrate down here around Saigon. He wants to protect Saigon, and he wants to try to regroup and try to figure out a way how to best win this war around the southern part of South Vietnam. His orders are kind of misinterpreted as a retreat, and then it turns into a rout to where essentially the South Vietnamese army starts to disintegrate. Once it disintegrates, the North Vietnamese army takes advantage of that, and they roll tanks going down into South Vietnam to support the Viet Cong rebels. This is probably one of the more iconic images of the Vietnam War. It's essentially Americans and South Vietnamese people leaving on the last chopper out of Saigon. This is on the U.S. Embassy. This helicopter, there was a string of helicopters coming in. This helicopter is going to leave. It's going to go to Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base in another part of Saigon. Those people are going to get on planes, and they're going to end up on U.S. naval aircraft carriers out in the middle of the South China Sea to evacuate them out, because Saigon is falling. The North Vietnamese have won the war. They're going to take control. They're going to rename Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City, and the war's over. We were not able to protect South Vietnam from a communist invasion. Now, the integration of other forces into the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, there were Chinese soldiers, Chinese pilots fighting with the North Vietnamese, and there were Soviet Union pilots, or at least there were hints that Soviet Union pilots were helping out with the North Vietnamese. But as a hot part of the Cold War, there was no Soviet Union versus U.S. or even China directly versus U.S. This is fault. U.S. versus a proxy army. The North Vietnamese is funded and helped out with logistics from other communist nations. The results in the cost for us, we're going to have 58,000 plus casualties. The other thing about this is not only the casualties, but the number of wounded. So people with legs, limbs blown off from mines, shrapnel wounds, bullet wounds. That's going to be 303,000 plus. So that's a huge amount. However, if you're comparing that to the South Vietnamese, the soldiers and the civilians, 202,000 people are going to be killed, 1.2 million wounded. With the Viet Cong, 1.2 million Viet Cong and North Vietnamese people killed during the war. So if you're taking a look at it, it seems disingenuous to say it that way. The body count we win, the war we're going to lose. Right? But it's going to be a communist victory, because they're actually going to unite Vietnam under the red flag. Ho Chi Minh in the 1950s and 60s, he's talking about the French occupation, but he basically says, and I'm paraphrasing here, you will commit so many troops to this war, and I will essentially kill them. All right. I will probably lose more men, and again, this is a very bad paraphrasing, but he's essentially saying, I'm going to lose more men, but I'm not going to lose the will to fight you, to where you're going to give up. And that's essentially kind of what we did. We're not suited to that guerrilla war, and eventually public will turns against the war, and we're going to have to withdraw. All right, that's it for the major part of Vietnam.